In this episode, we're covering the disappearance of Brandy Myers.
A note from producer Bob Seifert. When I first heard about the disappearance of Brandy Myers, I immediately had a connection with Brandy. Why? Because I was Brandy. By that, I mean an innocent and naive kid like Brandy going door to door, collecting money for bike-a-thons and book-a-thons, oblivious to the danger that lurked there. Mine was a childhood of warm summers, comic books, and Slurpees. In spite of the dangers we are now aware of in hindsight, I remember those days with fond memories. Brandy never got the chance to grow up and look back at those days. That's why I thought it was so important to cover her case.
This episode is graphic, so please take care while listening. On May 26, 1992, 13-year-old Brandy Myers went door to door to collect money for a book-a-thon she had read the books for. Kids going door to door to sell things is now considered dangerous, but in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this was something kids regularly did. Kristin, Brandy's younger sister, had a sinking feeling in her stomach as she leaned over the balcony and watched Brandy walk around the corner in the neighborhood near their apartment. Still, she was only 11 at the time. She was too young to understand what this meant. Brandy didn't come home that afternoon, and when her mom returned from work, it was already after dark, and Brandy was still not home. Panicking, she dialed the police. Brandy Myers was never seen again. What happened to Brandy Myers? When Brandy's mother called the police, the investigation began immediately. Strangely, the neighborhood where Brandy went missing wasn't the first place the police checked. A girl who lived in Brandy's apartment complex told the police she had gone to a store named Schmitty's with Brandy. The girl stated that the money she earned from the book-a-thon was burning a hole in Brandy's pocket and Brandy wanted to spend it on candy and toys. The girl went to the bathroom, leaving Brandy in the lobby alone. When she returned from the bathroom, Brandy had vanished. The police searched extensively in the area around Schmitty's but found nothing. The girl had described a pedophile guy hanging around in the lobby, but this person was never found. This lead went nowhere. Kristin said Brandy was sweet, naive, and quiet and wouldn't have spent the money on candy and toys. Brandy was also excited about the book-a-thon's prize. This was the age before the internet, and Brandy, like most kids in that era, would have seen enticing flyers describing what you could win. This was also the era when toys were advertised on the pages of comic books and magazines. Hours were spent dreaming of Sony Walkman portable CD players and Nintendo Game Boys. Mostly, dreaming about it was almost better than actually winning it. Brandy's mother died inside when Brandy went missing. Kristin's dealt with the disappearance by going through the motions of life but never really living in the moment or dealing with what happened. The last words that Kristin said to Brandy would haunt her for the rest of her life. Brandy wanted Kristin to go door to door with her, but Kristin, then 11, told Brandy that she was a nerd and she couldn't be seen with her. Kristin would sink into drugs and desperation for 13 years, but she would come clean and begin the search for her sister anew. More sinister developments involving their neighbor Miller would point to where Brandy disappeared. After numerous searches and detective work, there was no sign of Brandy Myers. Over the decades, the police periodically pored over her case file, but they could not determine what happened to Brandy. But other cases would eventually shed light on Brandy's case. The last house to see Brandy alive in the neighborhood where she was canvassing houses was an elderly couple. 2 doors down lived a man named Brian Patrick Miller. 2 days after Brandy disappeared, searchers found the decomposed body of a teenager in a pile of trash. The unidentified body would be dubbed Jane Doe 92-1169. She had been strangled. In 2011, Maricopa County received a grant to research missing people. The body was exhumed and she would finally be identified as 16-year-old Shannon Ormack. At the age of 16, Shannon's mother was raped and became pregnant with Shannon. When Shannon was 3, her mother turned her over to Child Protective Services. A family adopted her, but due to behavior issues, she was returned to CPS at the age of 12. Shannon would bounce between foster, group homes, and a juvenile detention facility. She ran away more than 40 times. When Shannon disappeared for the last time, it was reported to CPS, but they never filed a police report, so there was no follow-up until Shannon's body was found. Shannon disappeared about the same time as Brandy. Shannon's murder was never solved. Several months later, in November of the same year that Brandy disappeared, 22-year-old Angela Brasso went out for a bike ride and never returned. Angela's headless body was found in an Arizona canal near West Cactus Road and Highway 17. Her head would later be located also near the canal. 10 months later, in September of 1993, 17-year-old Melanie Burness went for a bike ride just as Angela had. She also disappeared. Her body was found the following day. She had been stabbed to death. These 2 cases, known as the canal murders, would go unsolved for many years. Luckily, evidence that was preserved from the crime scene was found to contain the killer's DNA. In 2014, a genealogist worked to identify the surname of the killer by tracking the paternal lineage of the Y chromosome, and they got a hit. The surname was Miller. The police had a suspect on their list with that last name. He was Brian Patrick Miller. Miller, also known as the Zombie Hunter, has a long and dark history. When he was 15, he was sent to a juvenile facility after being charged with criminal damage. He was released in 1989. Only 2 months later, at age 16, he stabbed a woman while she was walking to work. He was sent to a juvenile facility until he reached the age of 18. Miller and his wife moved to Everett, Washington in the 1990s. There, Miller would attack and stab a girl walking to a bus stop. She took a shortcut through a bike trail. Miller leapt from the bushes and stabbed the girl in the stomach and neck. The girl fought hard and freed herself from Miller and knocked the knife from his hands. Somehow, Miller talked the girl into giving the knife back, promising not to hurt her again. But as soon as he got the knife, he resumed stabbing and choking her. Luckily, another person on the trail interrupted the attack. The case went unsolved until Brian Patrick Miller was later accused of the canal killings. The girl was shown a picture of Miller, and she was almost certain that Miller was the man that had attacked her on the trail that day. 2 years later, a woman was at a payphone calling a friend when a man approached her and offered her a ride. She accepted, and he drove her to his work. They were the only ones there, and when she went to use the phone, he grabbed her from behind and stabbed her. She managed to get away, and Miller was convicted of the crime, but he was later acquitted, claiming that the woman came to his work to steal money from him. So how does this tie back into the disappearance of Brandy Myers? Well, Miller lived on the street where Brandy was collecting payments for the book-a-thon. Brandy was last seen by a couple 2 doors down from Brian Patrick Miller. Initially, the police had talked to Miller about Brandy's disappearance. Still, the girl from the apartment had told the police that Brandy had disappeared from Schmitty's, and the police didn't focus on Miller. Given Miller's history, it is most likely that Brandy was never at Schmitty's that afternoon. The false lead would haunt this case for decades. After Miller was charged with the canal killings, his ex-wife made a startling confession. Please be warned, the next section is extremely graphic. Miller's ex-wife stated that Miller had her tied up, and he confessed to pulling a mentally challenged girl who was going door to door into his house and stabbing her multiple times. He then slit her throat, which caused her to bleed out and die. Miller then threw her body into the bathtub. He was hoping to preserve her body so that he could have sex with her later, but he was so excited that he turned on the hot water instead of the cold, which caused her to bleed out, and he couldn't do these things. When the neighbors started asking about the smell, Miller cut up Brandy's body, put it in trash bags, and put it in his trash. Miller's wife took decades to come forward with this information. It wasn't until after he was arrested for the canal killings, because at the time she didn't believe him. So much time had passed since Brandy's disappearance and no evidence remains. Brandy's body was most likely buried deep in the dump and no search is planned. Miller's house was searched for DNA, but after decades there was none to be found. Since Miller is already in jail for the murder of Melanie Burness and Angela Brasso, the district attorney has no plans of prosecuting Miller for Brandy's murder. Driven by sadness and haunted by the last words she said to Brandy, Kristin is pushing the DA to prosecute Miller for Brandy's death. As Kristin would say, Brandy never got to grow up, have her first kiss, or have her heart broken, and she deserves justice. Kristin has started a petition to motivate the DA to prosecute Miller. I put a link to Kristin Phelan's petition and to her YouTube video in our show notes. So what happened to Brandy Myers? Did she go to Schmitty's to spend the book-a-thon money on candy and toys as stated by her friend from the apartment? Did a pedophile abduct her? This lead went nowhere and wasn't corroborated by other witnesses, so it is unlikely that this event happened. Unfortunately, the girl from the apartment never retracted her testimony. This would damage the investigation for years. Did Brandy get lost and wander out of the neighborhood where she lived, never returning home? Also unlikely, since she walked through that neighborhood every day on the way to school. Then there is Brian Patrick Miller, who confessed to his wife about killing a girl who sounded like Brandy. Miller, a man with the murder conviction for the deaths of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness and perhaps Shannon Ormack. He also lived along Brandy's route that day when she was collecting money for the book-a-thon. Brandy and Kristin also passed by his house daily on their way to school, so he would have been familiar with Brandy and her sister. The most likely explanation is that Brian Patrick Miller pulled Brandy inside his house and stabbed her to death, just as he confessed he did. At the time of her disappearance, Brandy Myers was 13 years old. She was 4'9" and weighs 75 pounds. She has blue eyes and blonde hair. She wore prescription eyeglasses. She was last seen wearing a green t-shirt, denim skirt, and high-top shoes. She was last seen in the area of 5th Street and East Hatcher Road in Phoenix, Arizona. If you have any information about this case, please call the Phoenix Police Department's Missing Persons Unit at 602-534-2121. If you would like to write a letter to the Maricopa County Prosecutor and ask for Brian Miller to be prosecuted for Brandy's murder, here is the address. Maricopa County Attorney's Office, Bill Montgomery, 301 West Jefferson Street, Phoenix, Arizona, 85003. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And if you or anyone you know has a loved one that is missing, please fill out our case submission form. There is a link in this video's show notes.